Well, hello again, and another very warm welcome back to everybody to my classic dirt bike TV channel, and this special hello here to the many brand new subscribers who have signed up since my last video posting. And I do hope you find something in here to entertain you with regards looking at these old vintage race bikes. Now, we're still in the planning stages to make dates and times available to go and film brand new material for my channel, and as soon as we get those dates and times organised, we will make the journey to go and film that brand new material, and then of course post it soon after here on my channel. So I do hope you will stay with me and take a look at these brand new bikes that will be coming up soon here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. But until then, of course, we still have a lot of good bikes for you to take a look at, and in this latest video we're going to take a look at more of those bikes from around the paddock. So I do hope you enjoy this latest batch of machines, and we're going to kick off with Donny Bruce's very nice TT560 Yamaha. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video. Okay, our first machine that we're going to take a look at is Donny Bruce's nice TT560 Yamaha 4-stroker. Now, this is a bike that I don't know too much about, and it's certainly not an original example, that's for sure, but despite that, it looks like it's capable of being quite quick on the track with that big 560 Yamaha motor and that quite unique exhaust system that goes from a single header pipe at the front to a pair of nice tailpipes at the rear. And as you can see, Donny's bike also has this custom embroidered seat cover. Now, the bike also has what looks like an original TT Yamaha alloy fuel tank, but as well you know, it's these big 4-stroke motors that make these bikes what they are, because these TT500 power plants have a very good reputation for ruggedness and reliability, and naturally these are not the lightest of motors if you're looking for a motocrosser that you can throw around the racetrack. But if you like your big thumpers, then you will instantly take to this machine with its powerful and very torquey single cylinder motor. Now, as I mentioned, unusually this bike has a twin tailpipe setup at the rear, whereas most owners of these TTs opt for a single tailpipe at the rear just to keep the overall weight to a minimum, although it certainly adds something different to this particular 560. But nevertheless, a nice and unusual looking bike, although still quite quick on the racetrack. And like I said, these TT Yamahas are very popular choices for classic 4-stroke owners and riders. And a good 4-banger rider can still get decent results on one of these bikes if he's prepared to muscle it around the racetrack. Now, while we're on the subject of talking about vintage iron, this is an old Sidecar Rig that I spotted at the Nostalgia Scramble a few years back, and although this looks like a pile of motorcycle parts, it's certainly an old Sidecar motocross outfit that's been powered by a 500 CCM B50 motor, and although it may not look it, this combination of frame and motor parts are still pieces of rusty gold and still worth saving if you're into your motocross racing sidecars. But even on their own, these CCM engine casings are still very much sought after items, as original CCM parts, as you know, are becoming rarer by the day to find. And even although the casings look empty of any of their internal parts, they still have a lot of value if someone is in the process of building a classic CCM solo machine and need original engine casings. Now, whether this rig was on sale on the day, I'm not exactly sure, but well, let's face it, it's certainly not going to be taking part in the actual race event on the day, but it's certainly a project that you could do something with, whether you were going to restore and race it or just sell it on for its sum of parts. But it's an interesting piece of vintage memorabilia all the same. Okay, next up we're going to take a quick peek at Rupert Hills HPF Honda 4-stroker. Now these are cracking machines, these horsepower factory 500 Hondas, which as well you know are based around the Honda XR500 engine, and then of course HPF then work their magic with some tuning and hot cams and other upgrades to make these into pretty damn quick 4-stroke racers. Now Rupert's machine has had to be modified at the rear end, and he had to have the shocks lengthened quite a bit in order that he could fit his 6-foot 8-inch frame onto the bike. Now I have to say that when I first met Rupert and filmed these video clips, he's the only person in a very long time that I've actually had to look up to because of his enormous height. Now I'm 6'4" myself, so it was like a coming together of the giants at the time, but who said that you had to be short and stocky to be a motocross racer? And this rear view of Rupert's bike will give you an idea of just how tall Rupert is when he slings his leg over this extremely high machine. Although as you'd expect, these big Honda motors sound great through these big megaphone tailpipes, and again these HPFs are very popular with 4-stroke thumper riders, but they're not as cheap to buy as your regular 4-banger XRs. Now this next bike is Jim Greaves' 500 Honda Twinshocker. Now this is another of those hybrid Hondas whereby you take a later 500 water cooled Honda motor and then fit an air cooled cylinder and head onto the crankcases to give you a 2-stroke air cooled twin shock eligible racer. Now in this shot you can see where the water pump was housed on the end of the crank, which has now been blanked off, as of course you no longer require these, but these are hugely popular mods on these 500 Hondas these days, and many riders now are converting their later water cooled motors to this air cooled type of configuration. Now because the motor is usually taken from a later 1980s era of machine, it would have had a monoshock rear suspension as well, and that's another modification that's now popular on these CR500s to change the rear swing arm and suspension to a twin shock setup, which then of course allows them to be raced in most of the twin shock racing championships around the UK. But again, these 500s are not for the faint-hearted, and these big open class Hondas can certainly get a shift on if you have a rider with big enough cojones to hustle the bike around the racetrack. And if you get these bikes set up right with regards their suspension and engine tuning, then I can guarantee you that there won't be many bikes that will come past you in the course of a race event. And if they do, then maybe you're sitting on the wrong bike and it's time to go for something more suitable to your talents. Now this next little bike is a nice 250 KX Kawasaki that I spotted at the Cumberland Grand National a couple of years back. Now I'm not sure as to the year of the bike, but it certainly could be a 1975 example or thereabouts, but it's a tidy little machine and looks in quite good original condition, apart from the rear shocks and of course that replacement exhaust expansion chamber. But again, these older KXs they're not really bikes that you see these days at classic and vintage race event, and this example certainly has quite a long pair of shocks fitted at the rear, so it's maybe a tallish kind of rider who actually owns it. But of course around 1975 Kawasaki made 3 versions of this bike, with a 125, this 250, and of course the bigger 400 KX model, but things like the handlebars, fuel tank, seats, suspension and wheels and a few other parts were all interchangeable between the models, and even the chassis were common to all the models, although if you wanted to fit the bigger 400 motor into the same frame, you needed shorter engine mounting plates. But this is a very nice example nonetheless. Okay, our next machine is Lee Johnston's 1980 CanAm 250, and yet again another of those quite rare classics that you very seldom see these days. And this example of Lee's looks in very good original condition for a bike that's now heading for 41 years old, and as I remember, I think these were called the MX6 CanAm models. Now, CanAm, of course, were a division of the huge Canadian Bombardier company, who were more famous for building their ATVs and snowmobiles, although they did build a few decent motocross racers like this MX6, which was powered by that superb Rotax two-stroke motor, which of course Bombardier also purchased in 1970, and hence their name on the Rotax engine casings. Now, CanAm actually enjoyed more successes on their off-road bikes in the early 1970s, and by that time this MX6 came along in 1980. The Japanese Big Four of Suzuki, Yamaha, Kawasaki and Honda were all beginning to build lighter, faster and more reliable motocrossers, and CanAm's finest hour of course came in 1974 when they secured a 1-2-3 finish in the 250 National Motocross Championships. But these were not too bad machines at all, these MX6s, but of course in 1980 this would be the very last of the CanAm motocross racing machines. Okay, coming up next on our Volume 9 Vintage Dirt Bike list is this British-built Greaves 250 Griffin. Now, these Griffins were the replacement bikes for the older Challenger models, which had that unique banana-style leading link suspension system on the front, although these later Griffins still had that as an option if you wanted the older suspension system on your particular Griffin bike. Now, these Griffins were powered by this piston port two-stroke Greaves motor with that very substantial barrel and head, which is said was designed to improve the cooling of the engine, as many of these Griffins were exported to the USA to be used as desert racing bikes, so hence the need to design this large surface area to try and get rid of some of that excessive heat. Now, the motor also had a 4-speed gearbox and, as I remember, an all-metal clutch that had 7 steel plates and 7 brass plates, which was quite an unusual setup for an off-road racer, but apparently it all worked very well in practice. Now, again, as I recall, the frame and swing arm were all made from Reynolds 531 steel, and bronze welding was used to stick all the parts of the chassis together. Now, the bike's fuel tank and side panels were all manufactured in fiberglass, which in the late 1960s was a material of choice for most off-road motorcycle parts, as these were of course the days before plastic was king. But these were decent bikes and certainly sold in big numbers in the USA and in Europe. Okay, we're going to finish off this video by taking a quick look at some very nice CCM racers from the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this first pair of machines are Raymond Thompson and Keith Barnes' lovely Clues Strokers. Now, as you already know, these Strokers were the very first machines that Alan Clues ever built when he bought over the defunct BSA department in the early 1970s, and it was a few years after before he even registered the name Clues Competition Machines. Now this particular stroker is not a fully original bike from that period, as Joe Maxwell Engineering is now making replica frames for these strokers, and as far as I'm aware, Joe can supply just about every other part that you need to build your own version of these iconic race bikes. But these Clues stroker replicas are almost identical to the original bikes from the early 1970s. Now these nicely sculpted exhaust systems are manufactured by Racin's Exhaust Systems, and the bike's motor is of course powered by the legendary BSA B50 4-stroke engine. Now thankfully though, there are plenty suppliers nowadays who can supply parts for these Clues strokers, or even the later CCMs if that's what you need, and people like Joe Maxwell Engineering and Keith Barnes are very good sources of supply if you're thinking of putting together one of these old British classics. Although this particular collection of Alan Clues classics that were on display at the Telford show were attracting a lot of attention over the course of the 2 days, but then again that's not surprising when you know that Alan Clues built these machines around what was essentially a standard old B50 500 motor. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that latest batch of machines from volume 9 of our bikes from the Paddock series. Some nice old classics in there, and a few old rusty ones as well, but nevertheless it's good to see these old classic bikes back in their natural habitat. Okay, coming up in my next video posting, we're going classic racing once again, and this time we're going to showcase a few races from the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's event that was held at Gore Bridge near Edinburgh in 2012, and we'll be having a look at a few races from that particular event coming up next. But until then, of course, everybody continue to be safe and well until we all get together once again to speak about more of these old vintage racers right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.